So, my friends, let's talk about the Kurds. Dear God, I'm immediately stepping on landmines here for YouTube. Yes, if the saying, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, applied to anyone in the Middle East, it is probably going to be the Kurds. And over the course of this video, we're going to be explaining to you why exactly that is the case and why this whole thing is so incredibly messy. So for those of you who've joined us here today, make sure to kick back and get comfortable, as we're going to be diving into the story of the world's largest stateless nation, the Kurds. For context of what it is that I'm talking about here and why it is that this is important, I just did a video on Syria and its subsequent collapse. In early December of 2024, a group of rebel militias would sweep through Syria and would rout Syrian armed forces all the way to Damascus. Once they'd finished humiliating the Assad regime's military forces, the seat of power in one of the world's oldest inhabited places was basically up for grabs. And I bet that even if you didn't watch the video that I did on it, you probably saw something about the event in the news, and you may have even heard a slew of various different acronyms that were being thrown around, or even heard the name of the man who led the revolution. Or maybe you heard his other name. Like, look, I kid you not, when I talk about this here, my friends, this is easily one of the most complex geopolitical conflicts we have ever talked about on this channel, and we've done a video on Myanmar and Somalia and so much more. But we're going to do our best in order to bring you up to speed, and we're also going to provide context as to how this revolution could lead to wider conflicts in the region, potential war crimes and human rights violations, and so much more. Or, as they probably call it here in Syria, just another Tuesday. Of course, in order for me to be able to talk about that in the first place, and keeping with the tradition of what it is that we do on this channel, we're going to need to zoom back out and explore some much needed context in order to understand all of this. Because when talking about the Kurds, it is nothing if not very contentious. But my friends, I just need to go ahead and say something before it is that we go any further. As you all are aware, we largely cover history behind geopolitical issues, and in many cases, this can change from geopolitics to just straight politics. Because of that, no matter what it is that I cover or how it is that I explain something, there are going to be accusations that my presentation is part of a larger political agenda. I've been called left-wing, right-wing, and everything in between, with a number of interesting labels being thrown in there. But the reality is that none of you watching this will ever actually know what my political beliefs are, and I am never going to preach them to you. Now, of course, I'm not perfect, and I will never claim to be, but unfortunately, most sources of information on the internet are just not so clean-cut. Judging the bias of an information source is imperative to understanding an issue in its entirety. Like, take this issue with Panama as just an example. Depending upon where it is that you're actually getting your information from, you will find that left-wing sources tend to emphasize Trump's statements as being direct threats, using emotional language that highlights Panamanian sovereignty. Sources from the center tend to use a more analytical tone regarding potential actions and reflecting on geopolitical implications. Right-wing elements, on the other hand, focus on public sentiment about the canal's control, emphasizing socioeconomic critiques. Understanding these biases is absolutely necessary, and that is why I am grateful to be sponsored by Ground News, an app and website that I regularly use in order to compare my information sources in the first place. What Ground News does is it gathers articles from all around the world in one place so that you can compare just how different outlets are covering the same story. You can see a source's political bias, their factuality rating to understand how reliable their reporting practices are, and, whether or not they are privately owned by a state, government, conglomerate, or whatever. This is especially important now because considering that Trump is back in office, media sources around the world, I'm telling you this right now, they're going to have an absolute field day for the next 4 years. That means that you, the audience, need to be prepared for what is coming. Luckily, Ground News is giving my viewers 40% off the Unlimited Access Vantage plan, the same one that I actually use in order to make these videos in the first place. You can click the link in my description or head on over to groundnews.com/historyofelverything. And I would strongly recommend that you do this because subscribing not only supports my work, but also an independent team that is working to keep media transparent. This is arguably one of the most important things that we could have in today's day and age. Thank you, my friends, for listening, and thank you to Ground News for sponsoring this video. And now back to the show. You see, my friends, the story of the Kurdish people starts in what has been referred to as the cradle of civilization. Nestled just north of the Euphrates River, the area in which the Kurds live has traditionally been ruled over by, well, not necessarily the Kurds, but one force or another over the course of history, with the Kurdish people living on the land relatively peacefully for thousands of years. Meanwhile, conquerors would come in and take over the territory, where they would then lose it to another set of conquerors, and so on and so forth. That is what would happen. The Kurdish region has seen a long list of different invaders and conquerors: the ancient Persians, Alexander the Great, the Muslim Arabs, the Seljuk Turks, the Mongols, the medieval Persians, the Ottoman Turks, or even, if you want to count it, most recently, the United States in its 2003 invasion of Iraq. They have been through a lot, and you may then wonder, okay, how did they survive being invaded and attacked from so many different foreign powers? Well, the answer is mountains. The mountains near the home region have always been a source of safety, and when facing overwhelming enemy forces, they have traditionally withdrawn to the safety of these mountains. Because of this, the mountains are sacred to the Kurds, and there is even a very famous saying amongst the Kurds that states, and I quote, "Kurds have no friends but the mountains." It's a very literal statement, and it will become more clear as time goes on as to how important exactly that is, because with time, they managed to retain largely their culture and survived what most smaller ethnic groups of their time did not: annihilation or assimilation. The Kurds have always sought their own autonomy and independence. And even though they were never fully granted that freedom, they've learned to adapt in ways to survive their frequently replaced foreign leaders. We are not going to cover every single thing, but establishing this background is extremely important, so I hope you bear with me here while we explain this. After the Arabs came in and conquered the region, the Kurds would become Muslims in order to survive. This led to possibly the most famous Kurd of all time, Saladin. Yes, if you are curious about that, if you recognize the name Saladin and Richard the Lionheart like the great rivals of the Crusades, that Saladin, who founded the Ayyubid dynasty, he was Kurdish. Hundreds of years later, when the Ottoman Turks would roll through, they would switch over to being subservient to them, and then a few centuries later, the Persians would come to dominate the land, and they would switch to become Shiite Muslims. Really, it's a matter of combining independence with adaptability depending upon who exactly is in the area. But where the problems truly arise for the Kurds is when we reach the 20th century, as, well, most modern-day conflicts seem to arise out of. You see, as World War I approached, nationalist movements began to rise in popularity amongst many different ethnic groups that fell under the rule of the crumbling Ottoman Empire, among different territories. The Austrians, the Ottomans, the Germans, the French, pretty much every single group had to deal with these kinds of elements, but within the Austrians, and in particular the Ottoman Empire, this was very bad. This led to the secret pact signed by the French and the British, the Sykes-Picot Agreement. This agreement, signed in 1916, would contain the plans to carve up the Middle East into new nation-states and spheres of influence that the two European powers could then control either directly or indirectly through their influence. Syria and Mesopotamia had been provinces under the Ottomans, but according to this agreement, they would be turned into 5 new nation-states, with Syria and Lebanon going and being administered by the French, and Palestine, Jordan, and Iraq being under the control of the British. Ultimately, when World War I actually ended, the Treaty of Sèvres was crafted in order to settle the issue of how to break apart the Ottoman Empire. The treaty even included a referendum for the Kurds in order to decide on whether they were going to be independent or simply have autonomy. And this would have likely been the end of our story. Like, this could be the end of it right here. If things had turned out differently, the Kurds at this point would have actually had their own state. Except one thing. The new Turkish Republic, led by Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, the father of the Turkish nation, he did not want this. He rejected the Treaty of Sèvres. You see, my friends, the Turks wanted to have control over the entire Anatolian Peninsula, whether the Kurds wanted this or not. So, after a war was fought in the early 1920s, a treaty was signed, the Treaty of Lausanne. This is something that was hashed out and signed in 1923 and gave the Turks what it is that they wanted: control over the entirety of Anatolia. This, as you can imagine, would include the proposed Kurdish area. Due to this agreement, the lands on which the Kurdish people actually live would be split up and be governed by 4 separate countries, none of which were a new Kurdistan. Instead, this would be Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Iran. Fast forward a little bit of time, and during World War II, the Soviets would occupy the parts of Kurdistan that are located in Iran. However, instead of them gaining independence after the war, Iran would quickly reoccupy the region, and many Kurds from there would return to their homeland. While in exile in Iraq during the Soviet rule, Mustafa Barzani would go and organize the Kurds in Iraq to the Kurdish Democratic Party, or KDP. To this day, the KDP is the dominant political party amongst the Kurdish people, and it has consistently lobbied for rights of Kurds and the establishment of either a Kurdish homeland or at least more autonomy in the countries where the Kurds now live. This movement actually saw a decent amount of success. Over the course of the 1950s in Turkey, they had some moderate success in being elected to political offices. By 1960, this actually led many different Kurds to believe that they could change the system from within and eventually build a coalition inside the Turkish government that would be powerful enough to, if not gain independence, at least give the Kurds in Turkey some kind of autonomy. However, 1960 was not so kind to them. See, Turkey at that point had a coup d'etat that completely changed the face of Turkish politics. So elections? No, that was completely out the window at this point. And thus, from the 1960s, the military would dominate Turkish policy and created a very harsh and restrictive environment for the Kurds that would push the majority of Kurds towards, well, spicier ideologies, to say the least. And no, we're not talking about radical Islam or anything like that. We're talking about Marxist-Leninism. If you're wondering what kind of events would take place in order to be able to push a people towards more extreme ideology, you need to understand just how many things are happening here. And if there are any Turks in my comment section that go and get angry when I talk about this, yeah, this is the same kind of thing that anytime anyone mentions the stuff that happens with Greece or the Armenians or anything else, please understand that there are skeletons in everyone's closet, and unfortunately, in the 60s going into the 70s and 80s, there are a lot of skeletons in this particular closet. See, during this time that I'm talking about here, Turkey would go as far as to officially deny that Kurds even existed. If you're curious as to what it is that I mean, on census forms where they would go and actually try and measure the population, they would list Kurds as not being Kurds, they were mountain Turks. They would also go and ban the use of the Kurdish language in 1980, not just publicly, like in the case of education or at universities or anything else. I mean specifically privately. You were not allowed to speak Kurdish in your own home. This is a law that was not actually repealed until 1991, by the way. Many people who spoke, published, or just sang a song in Kurdish were arrested or imprisoned by the Turkish government. As you can probably imagine, this is something that would radicalize a decent percentage of the population. And so, as time went on from the 70s going into the 80s, a new young generation of Kurds were being influenced by Marxist ideology, and they fused that with both revolutionary socialism and Kurdish nationalism. The result? The Kurdistan Workers' Party, more commonly known as its very spicy name in the Middle East, the PKK. This revolutionary group, led by Abdullah Ocalan, aimed to obtain Kurdish independence as part of the worldwide communist revolution that many left-wing people thought was going to happen in the 1970s and 80s. You have to remember that at this time we were talking about the Cold War here, and so a number of ardent ideological believers thought that World War III was coming and it was going to be the rise of the proletariat. Which, on that note, before it is that we go any further, yes, we need to address the elephant in the room. Yes, the PKK was designated as a terrorist organization by Turkey and its allies, including the United States and the European Union. That did happen. And for the first 15 years of its existence, honestly, you can probably see why that is the case. It is understandable why many Kurds were angry and radicalized during this time, but the results that would take place because of that were quite nasty. The PKK were responsible for bombing many different city centers, recruiting child soldiers, and using terror tactics like massacring civilians on numerous different occasions. The worst of these happened in the mid to late 1980s, following the 1984 announcement by the PKK that there was a general Kurdish uprising. This was done by Abdullah Ocalan in order to unite the Kurdish liberation movements of the PKK with one in Iraq that was active in fighting against Saddam Hussein. That, you could argue, was the high point of revolution, but what you're going to see as we continue on is that by this point, the PKK are losing more of their terrorist elements. See, when I talk about this, one of the most fascinating things that makes the PKK unique is the ideology of its most famous and revered leader, Abdullah Ocalan. In a region where most militia groups and resistance movements are specifically started by religious fundamentalists or jihadist extremists, the PKK was never a religious-based organization. In fact, it's one of the most ideology-focused militia organizations in existence. Because Ocalan was influenced by so many different schools of thought, the PKK would grow, change, and mature along with Ocalan himself. From its 1970s foundations based in Marxist-Leninism to the freedom fighter period of the late 80s, the PKK would reach the 1990s and would actually change. Ocalan was getting much older by this point, and after a literal decade of war, he could see that things just really weren't changing for the better with the current tactics that they were utilizing. And since the conflict had begun, more than 40,000 people had died, the majority of which were simply Kurdish civilians. So, the PKK changed course. In 1995, it and Ocalan would change their demands from full independence and the establishment of a Kurdish state to instead demand for equal rights and Kurdish autonomy within the Turkish state. Now, when I say this, it does not mean that they laid down their weapons and gave up by any means. Oh dear God, no. With the exceptions of a couple ceasefires, like from 1999 to 2004 and 2013 to 2015, the PKK was still fighting the Turkish military. That is still something that happens. But this was still a clear message that would resound in 1995, that the goal had shifted and now was much more realistic. In 1995, Ocalan would say, and I quote, "We are not insisting on separate states under any condition. What we are calling for, very openly, is a state model where a people's basic economic, cultural, social, and political rights are guaranteed." Which sounds well and good, but technically speaking, he was still an enemy of the state, or I should say enemy of the states, considering how many places the Kurds were in. Until 1998, Ocalan was based out of Syria. He lived mainly in a protected neighborhood in Damascus, until someone was tipped off about his location and then tried to assassinate him in 1996, which would start the process of him trying to figure out where to go. While living in Syria, he would write numerous different books specifically about the Kurdish revolution. By the year 1998, though, the Turkish government was fed up, and tossing aside any sense of diplomacy, openly threatened Syria with military action if they would keep harboring Ocalan. And the Syrians, being an old pal of Ocalan, would not really want to give him up, and so they would kind of do the nice thing. They would tell Ocalan, hey, you don't have to go home, you don't have to leave and go to Turkey and be given up. Instead, just get the hell out of here. So they made him leave the country, but they didn't extradite him back to Turkey, which was pretty nice of them to do, all things considered. Ocalan would then go on a kind of public relations tour of various different European countries, seeking both asylum as well as recognition of the situation regarding the Kurds. Among all these places, you would think, oh, he's going to go to the West and start speaking to the varying different nation-states about the oppressed peoples. But no, actually, his first thing was that he went to Russia, where the Russian parliament almost immediately voted to grant him asylum. And all things considered, he probably should have stayed there, in the interest of his personal safety as well as security. But Ocalan was about more than that. When offered an opportunity to go and visit Greece and speak to the Greek parliament, he took it. While in the neighborhood, he also decided, hey, I might as well go visit Italy and state my case there. Except, here's the problem. He wasn't really invited to go to these places. And it was at this point that a German arrest warrant on him was acted upon, and the Italians would prepare to extradite him to Germany. At this point, you're probably thinking, okay, well, that's probably where his story ends, but no! The German Chancellor himself, Gerhard Schroeder, as well as the German Minister of the Interior, both spoke out against him being sent to Germany, as they insisted upon him being tried by a, quote, European court, although they never actually went and specified what exactly was meant by that. Regardless, the message was sent to the Italians that the Germans didn't actually want to get involved. So, the Italians, saying that it was contrary to Italian law to just send him back to Turkey, where he faced capital punishment, would eventually allow him to leave, and he would fly back to Russia, where he actually received a way less warm welcome than he had months prior. At this point, realizing that he may have burned the bridges with Russia, he flew back to Greece, where he got a flight to the Netherlands, where he hoped to state his case at the International Criminal Court in The Hague. But the Netherlands wouldn't even let his plane land in the country, so at that point, he gets sent back to Greece, where he briefly stays, and plans a trip to Nairobi, Kenya, where he hoped to gain African support for the Kurdish cause. Like, this guy was going everywhere. Only problem is, he was never really going to make it. When he landed in Nairobi, Ocalan was on his way to the Greek embassy when he was abducted and captured by the CIA, working in a joint operation with the Turkish National Intelligence Organization. They transferred him to Turkish authorities, who would fly him back to Turkey in order to face trial. He was taken to Imrali Island, a tiny speck of land less than 4 square miles in the Sea of Marmara, situated southwest of the Bosphorus Strait, and this would be the site of both his trial and imprisonment, as the Turkish government put on one of the most mock trials in all of history. For clarification on what it is that I mean, he was interrogated brutally for 10 days without being allowed to speak to a lawyer. A state security court of 1 military and then 2 civilian judges were then assembled, and at this point, 3 Dutch lawyers show up intending to defend him, but are stopped at the airport and accused of being PKK militants and not actually Dutch lawyers. This is already bad enough, but on the 7th day of interrogations, even one of the judges took part in it, which you would think at this point has to be a serious violation of ethics and protocol in most legal systems. The judge even provided transcripts of the day that he was there. Either way, after his capture, Ocalan called for a halt in PKK attacks and advocated for a peaceful solution to the Kurdish conflict inside the borders of Turkey. Ultimately, his trial would begin on May 31st, 1999. And from the start, it was very obvious that the Turkish government refused to let him actually have a fair trial. They only let his lawyers see him twice a week for 20 minutes, and that's if it was a week of good weather, because if the weather was bad, they would always just claim that, oh, it was the weather that was the reason the lawyers couldn't speak to their client. I'm not even kidding about that. Adding to this ridiculousness, the Turkish government refused to even tell his lawyers what their client was being charged with, and they only received the official indictment after sections of it had already been released to the press. In the end, Ocalan was charged with treason and separatism. He was banned from holding public office for life, and considerably worse, sentenced to death, which obviously he's not going to serve in office anymore if he literally dies. On the same day his verdict was read, both Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch would demand a retrial due to the fact that witnesses brought forth by the defense were not actually ever allowed to speak at the trial. In January of 2000, the Turkish government would end up delaying his death sentence until the European Court of Human Rights reviewed the verdict. Ultimately, they accepted Ocalan's case in 2004, and in 2005, the ECHR ruled that Turkey had violated Articles 3, 5, and 6 of the European Convention of Human Rights by refusing to allow Ocalan to appeal his arrest and by sentencing him to death without a fair trial. Eventually, his death sentence was changed to life imprisonment, as Turkey actually got rid of the death penalty in its legal system. But that didn't change the fact that the Turkish government seriously did not play when it came to matters concerning Ocalan. This man was going to suffer. He was kept in solitary confinement as the only prisoner on Imrali Island for nearly 10 years. Imrali had other prisoners there initially, but when Ocalan showed up, they sent them all away, simply so that Ocalan could be held in solitary. So, this is going to sound absolutely ridiculous, mind you. They had over 1,000 Turkish military personnel stationed on the island to guard one man. And they did this for almost a decade. Like, we're talking about Napoleon levels of exile, people, if you understand what I'm talking about here. Eventually, due to pressure from the Council of Europe's Committee for the Prevention of Torture, which, oh dear God, that's a name, the Turkish government relented and moved some prisoners back to the island that Ocalan was allowed to interact with for up to 10 hours a day. To get back at Ocalan for having to do this, though, they denied him access to see his lawyers for 8 years. More than 700 appeals were filed for his lawyers to be allowed to see him, with every single one being rejected. In October of 2012, several hundred Kurdish political prisoners went on hunger strike for better detention conditions for Ocalan and the right to use the Kurdish language in education as well as jurisprudence. The hunger strike would last 68 days until Ocalan demanded its end. Now you may wonder at this point, okay, what was Ocalan doing while all this was happening? Was he losing his mind in solitary confinement? No, he actually followed in the steps of Nelson Mandela and became something of more than just a leader. He became an icon to all Kurdish people. I mean, when we talk about this, to this day, Ocalan remains in prison on Imrali Island. He is still there. Ironically, at the time that I'm even making this, if he somehow dies over the course of this, I will feel so incredibly dumb. But he is still there and still maintains massive levels of influence on his people from a jail cell. During his incarceration, he was reading and learning and further developing his own ideologies. He was on the search for the perfect form of government to ensure his people's survival. And through this search, he actually cast aside his prior Marxist-Leninist beliefs and began to be influenced by Western social theorists such as Murray Bookchin, Emanuel Wallerstein, and Hannah Arendt. Eventually, he embraced the ideals of democratic confederalism. And before you ask in the comment, like, oh my God, Stack, what the hell is this? Why are you throwing out all these terms? I'll explain. Democratic confederalism is a, quote, system of popularly elected administrative councils allowing local communities to exercise autonomous control over their assets while linking to other communities via a network of confederal councils. Basically, decisions are made by communes in each neighborhood, village, or city. All are welcome to partake in the communal councils, but political participation is not mandated. There is no private property, but rather ownership by use, which grants individual usage rights to the buildings, land, and infrastructure, but not the right to sell and buy on the market or convert them to private enterprises. The economy is in the hands of the communal councils, and this is thus, in the word of Bookchin, neither collectivized nor privatized. It is common. It is everything. It's a bit messy. It's one of those confusing things, but other kind of political and social thought are incorporated in it, such as feminism, ecology, and even direct democracy. These are all essential in democratic confederalism. With his 2005, quote, Declaration of Democratic Confederalism in Kurdistan, Ocalan would advocate for a Kurdish implementation of Bookchin's The Ecology of Freedom via municipal assemblies as a democratic confederation of Kurdish communities beyond the state borders of Syria, Iran, Iraq, and Turkey. Ocalan would promote a platform of shared values, environmentalism, self-defense, gender equality, and a pluralistic tolerance for religion, politics, and culture. Now, when I talk about this, my friends, that is very obviously a massive shift in the way that he viewed the world, especially considering this is only over the course of like 30 years. And you might think, okay, there is no way that the folks back home would ever go along with it, especially this being a part of the world that wasn't exactly known for treating women very well. But the crazy thing is, apart from some naysayers, the Kurds actually welcomed this change and implemented it within their society. The PKK immediately began to form municipal assemblies. They also changed their strategies, and for the most part seemed to no longer commit terrorist acts or condone the use of terrorism in order to solve the Kurdish problem. So, essentially, the PKK were a terrorist organization in name only at this point in time. Nowadays, the Kurds make up a fifth of Turkey's population, coming in at somewhere between 15 to 20 million. So it's kind of wild that so many people just accepted an ideology so vastly different from everyone around them. That is the kind of power and influence of Abdullah Ocalan amongst the Kurds. Now I hope it is that you understand why it is that we spent so much time telling that particular story. And interestingly enough, this ideology spread throughout much of Kurdistan and forms the basis of the Democratic Union Party, or PYD. This is the leading party amongst Syrian Kurds and forms the backbone of the ideology of the Autonomous Administration of North and East Syria, also known as the AANES, which, if you say it out, sounds like anus. There's going to be so many comments, I already know it. So, here it is then. Kurdistan, as a conceptualized country, generally comprises the following four regions: southeastern Turkey, which is northern Kurdistan, northern Iraq, which is southern Kurdistan, northwestern Iran, eastern Kurdistan, and northern Syria, western Kurdistan. We're going to go into each of these regions and discuss how it is that they started and where they're at today. We've already mentioned northern Kurdistan in Turkey, so we're going to be moving on after this to southern Kurdistan, situated in Iraq. Here, the Kurds number between 6 and 9 million people, yet they've actually had better success than the Kurds in Turkey at gaining some semblance of autonomy. See, in 1946, the Kurdish Democratic Party, or KDP, was founded by Mullah Mustafa Barzani, which pushed for Kurdish autonomy under the Iraqi government. They were the primary group pushing for Kurdish rights in Iraq for the next 30 years. After this, you would have the Second Iraqi-Kurdish War, which would happen, and while Abdullah Ocalan was forming a leftist revolutionary party in Turkey, a new Kurdish party was forming in Iraq. This party was the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, or PUK, which was led by Jalal Talabani. Now, from their formation, the PUK and the KDP didn't really see eye to eye on many issues and lacked cooperation. Eventually, in 1975, the KDP and the Iraqi government would go to war again. This time, it was over the 1970 peace plan for Kurdish autonomy that the Iraqis had worked out with the KDP after the first Iraqi-Kurdish war and soundly ignored for 5 years. When the open conflict started, it was dubbed the Second Iraqi-Kurdish War, and the conflict was quickly ended by the Iraqi military as the KDP lacked heavy weaponry as well as air support. After their defeat, the KDP would retreat to the mountains in a sort of exile. The Iraqi government couldn't shake them out of there, though, and from there, they needed to regroup. So it is then that for the next 3 years, the PUK would lead a guerrilla-style insurgency in Iraq against the government. The KDP would take up arms against them, and the fighting would stay in the mountains for the most part, because the PUK saw what happened to the KDP when they tried to commit to open and symmetrical conflict with the government. It didn't really go well. This period of insurgency only let up because the KDPI, the Kurdish Democratic Party of Iran, went and joined up with the Iraqi forces to help fight the PUK. Yes, that's right. The Iraqis enlisted Iranian Kurds to fight their own Iraqi Kurds. Due to this, Iran eventually started supporting the PUK, and the stage was set for the Greater Iran-Iraq War, which, oh dear God, that is a whole thing in and of itself. As Saddam Hussein came into power, things became significantly worse for the Kurds. Remember, but wait, It gets worse. He considered the Kurds in Iraq to be Iranians, and the last thing that he wanted was the spirit of the 1979 Iranian Revolution spreading to his country. At this time, Saddam was fully grasping power in Iraq, and the country was led by Sunni Muslims who Saddam had placed into office in order to make sure that the Sunnis stayed the ruling class in the predominantly Shiite Iraq. To put this in reference, Sunnis only made up about a fifth of the population of Iraq, but nearly every single government official was Sunni, in accordance with Saddam's wishes. And Saddam hated the KDP because they took sides with Iran once the Iran-Iraq war started. Also, because they were Shia Muslims. Also, Saddam had noticed that both the KDP and PUK had gained territory in Iraq while it was that he was busy fighting the Iranians. So he used the cover of the war to enact his revenge upon the Kurdish population of Iraq. In 1983, the Kurdish rebellion in Iraq was set off by Saddam when he ordered his army to abduct over 8,000 Kurdish men and boys from the Erbil province in northern Iraq. He attacked Erbil first because that's where the Barzani Kurds, leaders of the KDP, were from. Masoud Barzani, leader of the KDP, lost 37 family members during this event, and he barely escaped with his own life. Some reports would indicate that those abducted were sent to the Nugra Salman prison in the southern desert region of Iraq, where they were tortured, presumably to death. Later, the bodies of 512 Barzani men would be found in a mass grave. But Saddam was just getting started. It was at this point, in 1988, that he would go and order the Al-Anfal campaign to be undertaken. The name of this campaign was taken from the 8th Surah, or chapter of the Quran. Al-Anfal literally means the spoils of war, and it was used as the name of the operation because it was meant to be a systematic extermination and looting of the Kurdish homelands in Iraq. The Iraqi forces sent to execute the Al-Anfal campaign were led by Ali Hassan al-Majid. Ali was a cousin of Saddam's from his hometown of Tikrit, and Saddam would trust him to be as cruel as possible. History would later know him simply by his nickname, Chemical Ali. In February of 1988, Iraqi military forces would swarm into Kurdish-held lands, destroying everything that they could. This was a full-on effort consisting of a ground offensive, artillery bombardments, aerial bombings, destruction of settlements, mass deportations, firing squads, and infamously, as the name implies, chemical warfare. Approximately 4,500 Kurdish villages and towns were completely destroyed during the campaign. During mid-March, the PUK, in an alliance with Iranian troops and other Kurdish factions, would capture Halabja. This led to the poison gas attacks on Halabja on the 16th of March 1988, in which several thousand Kurdish people were killed, most of them being civilians. This, mind you, was the first time in recorded history that a country used chemical gas attacks against its own people, which is kind of a big deal. 250 villages would be attacked with chemical gas. Through 8 brutal stages of strategy, Chemical Ali had developed an efficient way of eliminating Kurds. Each stage of Anfal would consist of chemical gas attacks on populations that included civilians, including women and children. And when we talk about this wasn't war, this was just straight up eradication. Many fugitives were detained by Iraqi forces during this time, and men were separated from the women. The men were typically not seen again, and were executed if not taken to die in prison. The women and children were transported to camps, and from there, Saddam began to move poor Arabs from other parts of Iraq into Kurdish territory as part of his Arabization campaign. This was meant to weaken the societal bonds formed in Kurdish society and cause conflict in their communities. The actual reason Saddam wanted them gone was because there was oil reserves underneath much of Kurdish homelands in Iraq, specifically in the region around Kirkuk. Death toll figures for the Al-Anfal campaign are really at this point impossible to come by because they don't exist. In 1993, Human Rights Watch would release a report stating that, according to their best estimates, the death toll cannot conceivably be less, not more, less than 50,000, and it may as well be twice that number. The Kurds themselves would claim 182,000 dead, but this is something that has been hotly disputed by the Iraqi government. With their atrocities complete, the Iraqi government would withdraw, and every male Kurd between 15 and 50 in Iraq was either dead or had fled the country. The Kurdish resistance fled to Iran, and a generation of Kurdish women would come to be known as the Anfal mothers, or the Anfal widows. The biggest thing that would ultimately change things for the Kurds in the region would definitely have been the 1991 Gulf War that would follow. This conflict was brief, but brought precious attention, allies, and resources to the Kurds. After the war, Those connections would stay in place and would come in handy for a decade later. But after Saddam got put in his place by the Western allies, the Iraqi government and the Kurdish forces came to an uneasy stalemate that gave the Kurds some breathing room and a chance to regroup. Even when civil war broke out again from 1994 to 1998 between the KDP and the PUK, the Kurds still held onto a democratic government and continued to prosper once they weren't constantly being attacked by outsider government forces. In the end, when the US came back to kick Saddam out for good in 2003, the border between Iraqi Kurdistan and the central Iraqi state moved south considerably, allowing the Kurds access to water and oil resources. They also took over the city of Kirkuk and the areas surrounding it. Kurdish soldiers would come to the aid of US troops and would play a key role in helping oust Saddam Hussein from power. The Kurdish people would then continue to play an important role in Iraqi state building since the United States had invaded. Many Kurds seek to build an autonomous federal state in the post-Hussein era. However, a solution for Kurdish problems in Iraq was not even mentioned in the 2004 UN resolution that established Iraq's interim government. Since then, the Iraqi government has been making promises about greater autonomy for the Kurds. And while they do have a degree of autonomy, at least more than some other Kurdish groups, the Iraqi government has repeatedly broken promises to them or outright ignored things, such as the 2017 referendum, where the Iraqi Kurds voted to become an independent country. Fast forward a bit of time, and in June of 2014, the terrorist group ISIS would sweep through Iraq in what became known as the Northern Iraq Offensive. They specialized in using blitzkrieg-style attacks to overwhelm the enemy with speed, and they quickly captured several cities across northern Iraq. As the Iraqi government forces quickly withdrew, suddenly, the Kurds were the only thing standing in the way of ISIS. This brings to mind the particular soldiers that they had, Peshmerga, which means one who faces death. And these fighters would prove the name to be true in the fierce fighting. What is important to note here is that the Kurds did have a couple of advantages. They had the support of the United States at the time, and they knew these mountains and cities well. This was their home, and if the Iraqi army wasn't going to protect it from being stolen, they were going to do it themselves. For years, the Kurds would fight valiantly, and yet keep getting pushed back and having to give up ground, until suddenly they were fighting with their backs to the mountains. And that is where the Peshmerga have always done their best when it comes to fighting. Between a combination of American weapons arriving for the Peshmerga and American airstrikes punishing the Islamic State forces, combined with the fact that now the Kurds were fighting to save their own homes, they were eventually able to push back the Islamic State fighters and regain control of the country. It turns out that once a competent fighting force is under siege in their own territory that they are extremely familiar with, lightning-fast surprise attacks don't really have as much punch as they once did. In other words, the Islamic State attacked and captured a lot of cities, but the Kurds would just wait a couple of days and then retake them. Those who suffered the worst from this offensive group were the Yazidis. This being a group of Kurds who actually have their own religion that happens to not be Islam, or at least it is a variant of Islam. This is one of those things that's kind of hard to explain, and no matter what it is that I say, it's going to piss off a number of people. That probably requires its own video in and of itself when talking about the religious conflicts in the Middle East. Anyway, because this is YouTube, I can't go into every single detail about what happens here. That is something that probably would have to go onto a podcast episode. But as you can imagine, the Islamic State fighters were incredibly brutal. And by the end, typically all fighting-age men in villages no longer existed after it is that they went through. At one point, they had the Yazidis surrounded on Mount Sinjar, and they were trying to starve out mostly women and children. The Peshmerga would come to their aid, but even they had to leave until Western countries would respond with airstrikes to support them in getting the survivors off the mountain. By the year 2015, upwards of 71% of the global Yazidi population had been displaced by the attacks, with most Yazidi refugees having fled to Iraq's Kurdistan region and Syria's Rojava. Over a period of 3 years, the Islamic State militants would traffic thousands of Yazidi women and girls, and would kill thousands of Yazidi men. The United Nations would report that the Islamic State had trafficked around 10,800 Yazidi women and girls in a forced conversion campaign throughout Iraq. This involved selling them to fighters who had joined the Islamic State forces as their wives, and then typically, once they had been with the women, they would sell them on to other fighters. Ultimately, in the end, this wasn't going to last though. Eventually, ISIS was going to get kicked out, and the Kurds would take back much of their territory. At this point, it remains to be seen if the Iraqi Kurds will ever get full independence, but when it comes to Kurdish groups, the Iraqi Kurds currently hold the highest level of autonomy of any Kurds. From here then, my friends, we go and dive into the AANES, again, I can't believe I'm saying this, the ANES. We're diving into the, okay. All right, we're not going to do that. This is a serious video. In Syria, Kurds constitute 10% of the total population, somewhere between 2 to 4 million people, predominantly residing in northeastern cities, such as Aleppo and Damascus and more. The story of the Syrian Kurds is much like those of the Turkish Kurds, as for decades, Syria toyed with the Kurds and kept removing their citizenship at random. When the Ba'ath Party, which I've mentioned here before when I did my video on Syria, seized power in the 1963 Syrian coup d'etat, non-Arab languages became forbidden. Even private schools were banned for the Kurds, yet not for other ethnic groups in the region. This is because the Kurds are often identified for what they are not. They are not Turks. They are not Arabs, and their language is closer to Farsi than Arabic, yet they are not Persian. The Assad regime tried to strip away any sense of culture and ethnicity that they could, and changed names of places and towns, and outright evicted some Kurds from their lands in order to settle Arabs on it. Yet, they allowed the PKK to set up training camps in Syria since 1980. Now, why would they do this? That sounds kind of insane, all things considered. Well, because the Kurds were fighting Turkey, and at that time, Syria and Turkey were hostile to each other. So the PKK set up camps in northeastern Syria, where they strengthened their numbers and organized. Over time, the sentiments and ideologies of the PKK began to spill over into local Kurdish populations who lived in northeastern Syria, in the area now known as Anes. Oh, it's also called Rojava too, and we can, at this point, I probably refer to that now since, we've said that one a lot, and I don't think it needs to be said here anymore. The algorithm is already going to punish me as it is. So the Kurdish struggle in Syria, and more specifically in the Rojava region, started in 2004 with the Kamishli riots. This was a clash amongst football fans that suddenly turned political when Arab fans pulled out photos of Saddam Hussein, and why they would take photos of another country's dictator to a football match is kind of beyond me, but the Kurdish fans in attendance then replied with, and I shit you not, quote, "We will sacrifice our lives for Bush." Like George Bush. Like US President George W. Bush. The two sides then began to attack each other with sticks, stones, knives, and pretty much anything deadly that they could get their hands on. Government security forces would enter the city to quell the riot, which would fire at crowds, and the riots would result in around 36 people getting killed, with the majority of them being Kurds. This incident would light a fire in the hearts of local Kurdish communities, and they began to organize discreetly. Existing underground Kurdish political parties, the Democratic Union Party, the PYD, and the Kurdish National Council, KNC, would join to form the Kurdish Supreme Committee, KSC. From there, they would establish the People's Protection Units, or YPG militias, these being things that would defend Kurdish inhabited areas in northern Syria, i.e. Syrian Kurdistan and the Kurdish enclave of Sheikh Massoud in Aleppo. Originally a wholly Kurdish force, the YPG actually began to recruit Arabs and others from around 2012, so eventually it became somewhat mixed. As I'm sure many of you are aware, for those who saw the previous video that I had done on Syria and how everything just kind of went to hell in a handbasket there, eventually, when the Syrian civil war kicked off in 2012, the Al-Nusra Front, this being a group affiliated with Al-Qaeda, would decide that they were going to overthrow the Syrian government of Bashar al-Assad and then install an Islamic state ruled by Sharia law, much like ISIS would later do in Iraq. The YPG would fight back against them and had the most success of any group that tried to stop them. Ultimately, before the civil war, there had been numerous Kurdish militias in Syria, and none of them seemed to really agree on much, but the battlefield success exhibited by the YPG forced these other less successful groups to either join with them or be left behind as just irrelevant and not actually have any political authority. And so that's how terrorists are what caused Syria's Kurds to actually unite under one banner or one army. At this point, I should also mention the YPJ here. This is an all-female militia that took part in frontline fighting repeatedly during the Syrian civil war, and I have to mention that, of course. By the height of their growth in 2016, the YPJ's numbers had swelled to over 24,000. This means it was the single largest female fighting force on the planet, and if you look at anything in history outside of some stories of myths, this is probably the largest all-female fighting force that was actually a fighting force in recorded history. And the great thing about them, you may wonder? Well, they're actually competent. They held their own in the fighting. In comparison to other systems where someone may be put into a position specifically as an act of representation, and again, I'm not going to get social or political when I talk about this, these are people who were trained for years to be able to fight and defend their homes and families. They are very competent. They were expected to pull their weight and be competent with their weapon systems. Those Peshmerga who helped the remaining Yazidis get to safety in 2014, yeah, they were supported by the YPJ fighters who relished the fact that many Islamic State fighters found it very shameful to be killed by a woman. In a stroke of irony, many of the Arab and Yazidi women that would be rescued by the YPJ insisted upon joining the militia itself to get their chance to put their former oppressors 6 feet under the ground. Part of the YPJ's training even included a class on philosophy and feminist history. Eventually, the Yazidis would even form their own all-female units called the Sinjar Resistance Units, or YBS. Which, yes, I know, another acronym. I am sorry. That is what happens. There are a lot of these. We are talking about militia groups in the Middle East. There's going to be a ton of them. By this point, the YPJ still exists as a unit, but they're not fighting on the front lines anymore. They currently serve their people in support and medical roles for the most part, but they still do exist. Eventually, in 2015, both the YPG and the YPJ would join forces with the Free Syrian Army to become the Syrian Democratic Forces, while the al-Nusra Front would dissolve and reform without the more jihadist elements to become Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS. Remember when I did the Syria video? That is these guys. That is how important this is. These two forces would end up fighting alongside each other years later in 2024, when HTS would conduct a How to Overthrow a Country speedrun and completely demolish every force in front of them in Syria. And now, the leader of HTS, Ahmed al-Shara, is now the de facto president of a new Syrian government. The HTS is claiming to be all about inclusivity and respecting others' beliefs and traditions, and distancing itself from their prior terrorist days. If you ask them, they have nothing to do with Al-Qaeda or al-Nusra. In fact, they've recently gone on something of a public relations tour in order to ensure those who are worried that they will protect the rights of all people in the new Syria, with one rule that these people must follow. The rule is that all militia groups in Syria have to lay down their weapons and submit to the new government, lest they be charged with being against the government. Now, if you've been listening at all for the last half hour, you know that to the Kurds, being armed and capable of protecting themselves is kind of a big deal. So at this point, it's not likely that they're going to turn in their guns without a fight. They've asked to join up and become part of the new Syrian army, but were denied that request. So at this point that I'm making this, there's actually quite a lot of tension right now in Syria, while the government figures out what exactly to do with the Kurds. Will the Syrians repeat the well-worn tradition of using the Kurds for what they need them for and then forgetting about them in peacetime like so many others? We don't really know. The United States has been keeping around 1,000 soldiers in Syria for years now in order to continue fighting against terrorist groups and to aid the Kurds. The new Trump administration has discussed removing these troops. President Trump did try to remove troops from the Syrian Kurds back in 2019, but the criticism that he faced at that time for potentially making the decision amongst the military and intelligence communities was enough to cause him to change his mind. But what should happen if the Kurds need aid to survive against the new government? Well, we don't know. Will the Americans leave them to their fate? It is yet to be seen. The Kurds, as it is, are already fighting Turkish forces, who immediately encroached across the border into Kurdish, and we should say this, Syrian territory during the time the government was being overthrown and reformed. Turkish President Erdogan would say that he would like a, quote, buffer zone between the PKK station in Syria and his own borders. But does that give him a right to encroach into another country and seize their land? Well, the hostilities keep rising, and it seems like Erdogan won't rest until the Kurds are handled and silenced. So we don't know. The Kurds continue to be an important and divisive group geopolitically, yet they still want at least some degree of self-determination, even if it isn't complete independence in a country that was made for them. Now, as it stands, the goal of most Kurdish groups is to work within the borders and countries they live in, to provide more recognition and rights for Kurds everywhere. This will be most severely tested in Syria, where, if all goes right, they will be allowed to join the military just like everyone else, and they'll push the Turkish forces off their land. But if everything goes to hell for them, they'll be fighting their own government on one side and the Turks on the other side, and it will be another fight for survival and recognition, and another time where an enemy went from being a friend, temporarily, back to being an enemy again. At this point, though, the Kurds are used to it. Remember, their only friends are the mountains. With that, my friends, we are going to be ending things here today. Thank you so much for watching. Look, I know when I was talking about this that it was really hard to keep track of all these groups and subdivisions and everything else, and I know that my editor is going to have an absolute hell of a time going through this in order to be able to add things. So if there's any mistakes, anything else that we see, I'm going to apologize preemptively right now. I can already guess there will be a number of comments that point that out specifically. In short, the people that we're talking about here, the Kurds, they've been through a lot, and their story is something that deserves to be told, especially since it could lead to another war in the Middle East. Please leave a like or subscribe and check out our Patreon for extra content for as little as $1 a month. Make sure to buy my merch, because remember, it can always get worse, and simultaneously, if you like the conflicts in the Middle East and Africa, my Toyota Hilux shirt, Going Places, is only available for a limited amount of time. I'm actually getting rid of this shirt, as well as the More Money, More Problems shirt. So, if you want to get that while you can, make sure to do so. Thank you, my friends, for watching, and I will see you all here next time. Goodbye, guys.